Tonight, Canada fires back at Trump's tariffs.
We must respond with both purpose and force.
Slapping tariffs on some U.S. vehicles.
We are very worried to put food on the table.
Shutdowns, layoffs, a stock market slide, the worst day since the start of the pandemic. Still, Trump is unfazed.
The nightmare scenario that American leaders swore would never happen just happened. Without warning, Canada slammed the brakes on its oil exports to the United States, cutting off the single largest source of American energy overnight. Gas prices are spiking, industries are crumbling. Washington is scrambling for a solution, but there isn't one. Because this wasn't an accident. It was years in the making. How did America fail to see this coming? Why did Canada make such a brutal move now? And can the United States survive the economic collapse that's already begun? What's happening? America didn't see it coming, but Canada just pulled the plug on its biggest oil supply overnight. For decades, the United States had quietly assumed that no matter what happened in the world, it could always count on Canada to deliver a steady, reliable stream of oil. The pipelines were open, the contracts were signed, and the energy flowed south without interruption. But that assumption shattered suddenly. Canada announced that it would no longer supply the United States with more than $103 billion worth of oil and natural gas exports. The decision was swift, shocking, and devastating. What made this moment even more dramatic was how it blindsided Washington. Politicians and energy executives had long believed that Canada was too dependent on the American market to ever cut ties. They believed that geography, infrastructure, and trade deals made Canadian oil indispensable to the U.S. economy. But those beliefs were built on an illusion, and Canada had spent years quietly building the exit ramp. To understand why Canada took such a drastic step, we need to go back to the policy, the trade wars, and the political arrogance that pushed them over the edge. And that story begins with a betrayal Canada never forgot. If you're still watching, you're one of the few who actually wants to know the full story. So do us a favor. Like the video and subscribe so you never miss the facts they don't want you to hear. Why Canada turned its back on America. The trigger wasn't just one event. It was a series of escalating trade disputes that made Canada rethink its relationship with the United States. It started with tariffs. First, Washington slapped heavy tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum under the guise of national security. Then there were tariffs on lumber, agricultural products, and even automotive parts. Each blow hurt Canadian industries and strained the economic partnership. Canada issued warnings. Leaders in Ottawa made it clear that if the trade aggression continued, they would be forced to explore new markets and reduce their dependency on the United States. But those warnings were ignored. American politicians assumed that Canada had no other choice, that its economy was too intertwined with America's to ever walk away. That assumption was dead wrong. Behind the scenes, Canada had been working on a bold strategy to diversify its energy exports. It signed long-term agreements with Europe and Asia, invested heavily in liquefied natural gas terminals on both coasts, and built new pipeline infrastructure designed to bypass the U.S. entirely. When the trade wars escalated under President Trump's administration, Canada's decision became inevitable. The final straw came when the U.S. imposed restrictions on Canadian energy companies and threatened to renegotiate pipeline deals. That's when Canada made its move, one that would send shockwaves across the American economy. These decisions backfired spectacularly. Instead of forcing Canada to submit, they pushed America's closest ally into the arms of its competitors. And when the markets realized what had happened, the reaction was swift and brutal. How global markets reacted overnight. Wall Street didn't sleep the night Canada made its move, and the panic spread worldwide. As news broke that Canada was cutting off its energy supply to the United States, the financial markets went into freefall. Oil futures spiked to levels not seen in over a decade. Gasoline prices jumped overnight, and energy stocks across the board took a massive hit. Traders and analysts scrambled to reassess their projection. The United States had lost access to one of its most stable and affordable energy sources, and there was no immediate replacement. The ripple effects hit industries far beyond oil and gas. Manufacturing companies, airlines, and logistics firms all saw their stock prices tumble as investors braced for rising fuel costs. But the panic wasn't confined to Wall Street. Markets in Europe and Asia reacted to the news as well. Energy importing nations feared that the shift in Canada's exports would tighten global supplies and drive up costs. Central banks began to warn of potential inflationary pressures, and economists sounded the alarm about the long-term consequences. The United States found itself in uncharted territory. For decades, it had taken Canadian energy for granted. Now it faced a future where that energy was being shipped to America's competitors instead. But this was only the beginning. The real economic shockwaves were about to hit Main Street as consumers, industries, and entire states scrambled to deal with the fallout. The gas price surge that crushed American families. The real pain hit the average American family the next morning when they pulled up to the gas pump. Overnight, fuel prices exploded without warning. What had been a manageable inconvenience for months suddenly turned into a full-blown crisis. Within 24 hours of Canada's announcement, the average cost of a gallon of gasoline jumped by more than $1.25 nationwide. For many working families, that single overnight increase meant an extra $50 to $70 a week just to commute to work or drop their kids off at school. But the real damage wasn't just the cost at the pump, it was the ripple effect that hit every corner of the American economy. Delivery drivers, small business owners, school districts, and public transportation systems all felt the weight of soaring fuel prices. The price of groceries rose within days as the cost of trucking food across state lines increased. In rural America, where long commutes and fewer public transport options made residents especially vulnerable, the surge in fuel costs became a financial death sentence. The hardest hit were families already living paycheck to paycheck. For many, every dollar spent at the gas station was one less dollar for groceries, healthcare, or rent. Reports poured in from across the country of parents cutting back on meals to afford fuel, of people missing medical appointments because they couldn't afford the drive, and of families forced to choose between heating their homes and filling their gas tanks. The oil shock became a working-class disaster. The economic divide grew wider as middle and lower-income households bore the brunt of the crisis. Wealthier Americans could absorb the extra cost or even profit from rising energy stock. But for millions of working families, there was no escape from the financial strain. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. While Americans were reeling at the gas pumps, another, even more devastating consequence of the oil shock was unfolding behind the scenes, one that would literally leave millions of Americans in the dark: the blackout crisis. The oil shock didn't just hit the pumps, it took down the entire power grid. America's electrical system was already fragile, and it was heavily dependent on affordable Canadian oil and natural gas to meet energy demands. When that supply suddenly vanished, it exposed a massive vulnerability that no one in Washington had prepared for. The first blackouts started in the northeastern states. New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey experienced rolling power outages within 72 hours of Canada's announcement. These were not small disruptions. Hospitals, schools, and emergency services were forced to operate on backup generators. Millions of Americans spent nights without heat or electricity as temperatures plunged. The crisis quickly spread across the Midwest. Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio were hit next, as utilities struggled to source enough fuel to keep power plants operational. In California, power companies warned of energy rationing during peak hours. Entire neighborhoods were plunged into darkness as grid operators prioritized critical infrastructure over residential areas. This was not just an inconvenience, it was a life-threatening emergency. Seniors and medically vulnerable citizens who relied on electric-powered healthcare devices faced immediate danger. Grocery stores were forced to throw away millions of dollars worth of spoiled food. Traffic systems failed, leading to chaos on city streets. Businesses shut down as power outages made it impossible to operate. The federal government scrambled to coordinate emergency fuel shipments to the hardest-hit regions, but there simply wasn't enough supply to meet demand. Prices for electricity doubled in some areas, and in others, access to power became entirely unpredictable. The oil shock had officially turned into a nationwide energy crisis, and it wasn't just households and public services that were affected. America's entire industrial economy was now in jeopardy. Industrial America on the brink. Steel mills, car factories, airlines. Every major American industry that relied on affordable energy was now facing collapse. The energy crisis triggered by Canada's oil export shutdown didn't just raise production costs, it made operations nearly impossible. In Detroit, automotive giants like Ford and General Motors announced immediate production slowdowns. The cost of manufacturing vehicles skyrocketed as fuel prices surged and electricity costs became unstable. Factory workers who had survived previous recessions were now facing layoffs and plant closures. In the steel industry, production lines ground to a halt. It was no longer profitable to operate heavy machinery when the cost of keeping the furnaces running had tripled overnight. Plants in Pennsylvania and Indiana announced temporary shutdowns, sending thousands of workers home without pay. The airline industry entered freefall. Jet fuel prices, which had already been climbing, became unsustainable. Major carriers slashed flight schedules and raised ticket prices by as much as 50%. Entire routes were canceled, and airline workers faced mass furloughs. Across the country, small and medium-sized manufacturers were equally devastated. From food processing plants to construction materials suppliers, the cost of production outpaced revenues. Many were forced to close their doors permanently. It was a chain reaction. When factories shut down, suppliers lost business. When suppliers collapsed, logistics companies suffered. The backbone of the American economy, industrial production, was crumbling under the weight of an energy crisis that showed no signs of easing. And as industries fell apart, the political consequences in Washington reached a boiling point. DC scrambles too late. By the time Washington reacted, the damage was already done, and there was no way out. The initial shock of Canada's announcement had caught policymakers off guard, but as the days turned into weeks, the scale of the crisis became undeniable. In closed-door meetings, the White House scrambled to find solutions. Emergency sessions of Congress were called, and political leaders from both parties pointed fingers in every direction. Some blamed Canada for abandoning America. Others blamed the previous administration's tariffs and trade policies. But none could offer a clear way to fix the crisis quickly. Proposals were thrown on the table. Lift the tariffs, negotiate a new energy deal with Canada, ramp up domestic oil production, and even consider tapping into America's strategic petroleum reserves. But every solution came with consequences. Canada had already signed long-term energy contracts with Europe and Asia. Rebuilding that relationship would take years. Increasing domestic production would require environmental rollbacks and massive infrastructure investments that couldn't be done overnight. Meanwhile, energy executives warned lawmakers that the worst-case scenario was already here. Gas prices had doubled, blackouts were spreading, factories were shutting down, and public anger was reaching a breaking point. Protests erupted across the country. Farmers, truckers, factory workers, and everyday citizens flooded city streets demanding answers. The crisis wasn't abstract anymore, it was personal. Americans were losing their jobs, their power, and their economic future because of a trade war and a broken relationship with their closest ally. Washington tried to regain control. Emergency fuel shipments were authorized. Financial aid packages were passed to help struggling families and industries. But it was too late. The economy was already spiraling, and the damage could not be undone with short-term fixes. As America's economy spiraled, a dark truth began to surface. This disaster wasn't just a failure of policy, it was a scandal years in the making. The U.S. energy sabotage scandal. Behind the scenes, powerful insiders in Washington and corporate boardrooms had seen the warning signs. They knew Canada was preparing to pull the plug, and they did nothing. Leaked internal memos revealed that senior officials in the Department of Energy and top oil executives had received intelligence reports as far back as 2 years prior. Those reports warned that Canada was aggressively diversifying its energy exports and could abandon the U.S. market if trade tensions continued. The alarms were clear, but they were ignored. Why? Because of arrogance, greed, and political short-sightedness. Corporate lobbyists and political donors pressured Washington to maintain the tariffs, convinced that Canada's economy was too dependent to ever walk away. Energy giants funneled millions of dollars into blocking renewable energy legislation that could have reduced America's oil dependence. They buried the risk because short-term profits mattered more than long-term stability. The scandal didn't stop there. Emails later obtained by investigative journalists exposed a deeper rot. Top officials in multiple federal agencies privately joked about Canada's bluff, mocking Ottawa's warnings and assuring each other that no country would ever risk losing access to the lucrative American market. They gambled with the nation's energy future and lost. Even worse, whistleblowers came forward with evidence that senior officials intentionally downplayed Canada's strategy in closed-door meetings. They dismissed warnings from Canadian diplomats. They silenced economists who raised concerns. And they continued to assure the public that America's energy lifeline was unbreakable, all while Canada was quietly building the exit ramp. When the truth came out, it sparked outrage across the country. Congressional hearings erupted. Protests flooded Capitol Hill. This wasn't just a geopolitical failure. It was a betrayal by the very people who were supposed to protect America's economic security. The crisis wasn't an accident. It was a disaster engineered by arrogance, corporate greed, and political cowardice. And by the time the American public learned the truth, it was already too late to stop the collapse. While Washington was busy pointing fingers at Canada, scrambling to fix broken pipelines and calm Wall Street, a quiet power shift was happening much closer to home. Right across the southern border, how Mexico capitalized on America's collapse. As America's energy crisis spiraled, Mexico saw an opportunity and seized it without hesitation. While politicians in D.C. begged Canada to reverse course, Mexico's leaders realized they suddenly held the upper hand in a way they never had before. For decades, Mexico's energy sector had played second fiddle to its northern neighbors. Pemex, Mexico's state-owned oil company, had struggled with corruption, underinvestment, and falling production. But all of that changed the moment Canada pulled the plug on its oil exports to the United States. Overnight, American refineries and energy companies were left scrambling to find alternative suppliers, and Mexico was ready to step in. Almost immediately, Mexico ramped up oil exports to the United States, but they didn't do it out of goodwill. They did it on their own terms. With Washington desperate to keep the fuel flowing, Mexico was able to demand higher prices, renegotiate long-stalled trade terms, and rewrite energy deals that had previously favored the U.S. Every barrel of Mexican oil came at a premium, and there was no room for negotiation. The ripple effects didn't stop there. Behind closed doors, Mexico's negotiators used America's vulnerability to revisit the very trade agreements that had defined North American commerce. For decades, they pushed for revisions to the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, demanding better protections for Mexican industries, fewer restrictions on exports, and increased control over cross-border energy trade. And with Washington in crisis mode, there was little American leaders could do to resist. For Mexico, it was a geopolitical jackpot. What began as Canada's retaliation turned into Mexico's economic opportunity. Energy revenues surged, trade leverage shifted southward, and for the first time in modern history, Mexico wasn't reacting to an American crisis. It was profiting from it. While Washington scrambled to contain the damage, Mexico quietly rewrote the rules of North American trade, turning America's collapse into its own strategic victory. But Mexico wasn't the only player who saw America's vulnerability as an opportunity. As the dust settled in North America, the world's most powerful oil cartel was preparing a move that would make the crisis even worse. The Middle East strikes back. As America flailed, OPEC made a move that changed everything. The collapse of the energy relationship between the United States and Canada sent shockwaves across the globe. But in the Middle East, this chaos was seen not as a crisis, but as an opening, a chance to reclaim lost dominance in the global oil market. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, quickly realized that the American market was now more desperate and more vulnerable than ever, and they wasted no time exploiting it. Within weeks of Canada's announcement to cut off its oil exports to the United States, OPEC members convened an emergency summit. The outcome of that meeting would define the next decade of global energy politics. They announced a coordinated production cut, slashing millions of barrels of oil per day from the market. This move was a deliberate attempt to tighten supply and send oil prices soaring even further, knowing full well that American families, industries, and even Washington itself would be unable to stop it. The result was immediate. Oil prices skyrocketed overnight. American refineries scrambled to secure alternative supplies, only to find that the options were limited and far more expensive. Gas stations across the country were forced to raise prices again, adding fuel to an already raging economic fire. And behind closed doors in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait City, OPEC leaders watched with satisfaction as their power over global energy markets grew stronger than it had been in decades. Yet, while OPEC was tightening its grip, another major player was preparing its next move. Russia's energy empire expands. Putin couldn't have asked for a better gift. Canada's move handed him global oil dominance. With North American energy ties in shambles and OPEC squeezing supply, Russia moved swiftly and decisively. Moscow had been building its energy empire for years, using oil and natural gas exports to wield influence over Europe and Asia. Now, the United States' collapse presented the perfect opportunity to expand its reach. Russia began signing new long-term energy contracts with countries that had once depended heavily on American or Canadian oil. Europe, desperate to fill the gap left by Canada, turned to Russia despite deep political tensions. Asian nations like China and India, already close economic partners with Moscow, eagerly accepted the Kremlin's offers of discounted oil and gas. The strategy was twofold. First, Russia cemented itself as the world's most indispensable energy supplier. Second, it weaponized that position, using energy dependence as leverage in diplomatic and trade negotiations. The more the world relied on Russian oil, the more power the Kremlin held on the global stage. In Washington, policymakers watched helplessly as their former allies lined up to sign deals with Moscow. Any attempt to sanction or isolate Russia now risked plunging entire economies into darkness. America's energy crisis was no longer just an economic problem. It had become a geopolitical nightmare. But while the headlines focused on Moscow and OPEC, another quiet revolution was brewing far away from the corridors of global power. Africa's silent oil revolution. While Washington panicked, Africa quietly stepped up to fill the oil gap. As the world's attention remained fixed on the Middle East and Russia, African nations seized the moment to reshape their place in the global energy market. Countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Ghana had long possessed significant oil reserves, but years of underinvestment and political instability had kept them on the sidelines. Now that was changing. Faced with rising demand and skyrocketing prices, African governments fast-tracked energy reforms, slashed red tape, and courted foreign investment. International oil companies, eager to diversify away from the Middle East and Russia, poured billions of dollars into African oil fields, pipelines, and refineries. The payoff was immediate. Oil exports from Africa surged, providing much-needed relief to energy-hungry markets in Europe and Asia. For African economies, the boom meant job creation, infrastructure development, and new geopolitical clout. Yet this rapid rise also brought challenges. Questions about environmental impact, resource management, and whether the economic benefits would truly reach the people. Still, there was no denying the shift. Africa was no longer a marginal player. It was now a central pillar of the global oil economy. And as African tankers sailed toward new markets, an even larger transformation was unfolding behind the scenes. The decision to shut down $103 billion worth of oil exports to the United States wasn't reckless. It was strategic, and it paid off almost immediately. How Canada rebuilt its oil empire without America. The moment Canada announced its energy cutoff, global markets scrambled to secure new supply lines. But Canada wasn't left in the cold. It had spent years preparing for this moment, forging new partnerships and expanding its influence far beyond North America. The first major shift came with Europe. Long before the crisis, Canada had been laying the groundwork to export liquefied natural gas to the European Union. When American energy collapsed, European nations were desperate to diversify away from Russia and the Middle East. Canada stepped in to fill the void, signing multi-decade contracts with Germany, France, and even smaller nations like Poland and Finland. But Canada didn't stop there. In Asia, deals with Japan, South Korea, and India exploded almost overnight. Canada's Pacific Coast terminals, once an afterthought, became gateways to a booming energy trade with some of the world's fastest-growing economies. The result? Canada's economy surged. While the U.S. spiraled into blackouts and industrial collapse, Canada's energy revenues soared to record highs. Unemployment plummeted, infrastructure boomed, and most importantly, Canada proved to itself and the world that it didn't need America anymore. By the time Washington realized what had happened, it was too late. Canada had diversified its markets, secured its future, and ensured that its energy would never again be held hostage by American trade wars. The bridge was burned, and Canada had no intention of rebuilding it. The global energy bloc that replaced America. As the United States collapsed, a new energy alliance formed, and America wasn't invited. The shock of losing Canadian oil had shattered the global status quo. and the pieces were being quickly rearranged by America's rivals and former allies. In the vacuum left by Washington's weakness, a powerful new energy bloc emerged. This coalition was not formalized on paper, but its influence was undeniable. OPEC members, Russia, major African oil producers, and even parts of Asia began coordinating trade policies, infrastructure investments, and energy pricing strategies. They understood that a fractured America could no longer dictate terms in the energy market. For the first time in over half a century, the world's energy supply was being controlled by a coalition that had no interest in American leadership. The bloc's strategy was clear: maximize profits, minimize political interference from Washington, and reshape global energy policy in their favor. New pipelines bypassed the United States entirely. Trade deals were written without American involvement, and energy-dependent nations that had once aligned with Washington found themselves gravitating toward the new bloc, lured by cheaper prices and stable supply. For American consumers and industries, the consequences were devastating. Prices remained high, supply chains remained broken, and the United States' ability to influence global markets diminished with every passing day. The fall of American energy dominance wasn't just an economic crisis. It was the birth of a new world order. And as this new bloc consolidated power, other nations were moving in a different direction. The green energy revolution America missed. While the U.S. collapsed, other countries used the crisis to leap ahead in green energy. As oil prices surged and American industries faltered, the global community recognized an opportunity, a chance to reduce dependence on fossil fuels and embrace renewable energy solutions. What had once been a long-term goal suddenly became an urgent priority. European nations, long aware of their own vulnerability to oil shocks, accelerated investments in solar, wind, and hydroelectric energy. Countries like Germany and Denmark unveiled multi-billion-dollar initiatives to transform their energy grids, committing to phase out oil and gas dependence within the next decade. France and Spain followed suit, fast-tracking green infrastructure projects that had previously been bogged down by bureaucracy. China, already leading the world in solar panel production, poured resources into becoming the undisputed leader in renewable energy technology. Massive wind farms and solar installations sprang up across Asia, and strategic partnerships were forged to export this technology globally. Chinese companies secured contracts in Africa, South America, and even parts of Europe, locking in their dominance over the next generation of energy. Even smaller nations seized the moment. Costa Rica doubled down on its goal to become the world's first fully carbon-neutral country. Norway, already benefiting from a robust electric vehicle infrastructure, set ambitious timelines to eliminate fossil fuel consumption entirely. In the Middle East, countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, once defined by oil wealth, began aggressively investing in solar power to diversify their economies. Meanwhile, the United States was paralyzed. Political infighting, economic collapse, and an over-reliance on oil infrastructure left America incapable of joining the Green Revolution. As other nations embraced the future, America remained tethered to the past, shackled by its dependency and a broken energy strategy. And while the rest of the world built the energy systems of tomorrow, America watched from the sidelines, powerless and left behind. The world was moving on without the United States, and the new energy era wasn't waiting. The new global energy order. For the first time in a century, America wasn't leading the world. It was scrambling to keep up. The economic collapse triggered by the loss of Canadian oil was only part of the story. Beneath the surface, the global energy balance had shifted permanently. A new order had emerged, dominated by an alliance of energy producers and green technology leaders. Russia, the Middle East, and African nations controlled the flow of oil, dictating prices and terms. Simultaneously, China and Europe were steering the renewable energy revolution, setting global standards and exporting their technology to eager buyers. The United States found itself isolated. The trade agreements, supply routes, and political influence it once enjoyed were now held by others. Nations that had once looked to Washington for energy leadership were now aligning themselves with this new bloc. The consequences were severe. America's geopolitical power weakened. Its ability to influence global markets diminished. trade deficits ballooned as the country was forced to import more expensive energy while exporting less. The decline wasn't just economic, it was strategic, cultural, and symbolic. The American century had ended, and the rest of the world was moving forward without it. Yet, even amid the collapse, there were still paths left for the United States. Dangerous paths, but paths nonetheless. Can America recover? America has only 3 options to fix this crisis, and none of them are safe. Faced with an energy and economic catastrophe, policymakers in Washington were forced to confront hard truths. There was no simple solution, but 3 possible courses of action emerged. The first option was to attempt a diplomatic reversal, reopen negotiations with Canada, and offer significant concessions to restore the energy partnership. This would require lifting tariffs, rewriting trade agreements, and possibly relinquishing economic leverage to secure Canadian oil once again. However, the political cost of such a move would be enormous, and there was no guarantee that Canada, now aligned with other global partners, would accept. The second option was to double down on domestic energy production. The United States still possessed vast oil reserves, particularly in the shale fields of Texas and North Dakota. But ramping up production would take years, require massive investments, and face fierce political and environmental opposition. Additionally, it would do nothing to address the green energy revolution already underway worldwide. The third option was to pivot toward renewable energy, finally embracing the transition that other nations had already begun. This would involve unprecedented investments in infrastructure, workforce retraining, and the rapid development of wind, solar, and nuclear energy. However, this path required time, unity, and political willpower, none of which seemed readily available. Each option carried enormous risks. The economic damage was already done, and any course correction would take years to bear fruit. The American public, suffering under rising costs and widespread unemployment, demanded immediate relief, but there was none to give. The world had changed. Whether America could adapt, or if it would continue its downward spiral, remained the question that haunted policymakers, economists, and everyday citizens alike. So now the question is, can America ever recover from this? Can the country rebuild its shattered energy dominance? Or has the world already moved on without it? One thing is clear, the damage has been done, and the clock is ticking. But what do you think? Do you believe America can claw its way back and regain control of global energy? Or is this the beginning of a permanent decline that no policy, president, or pipeline can fix? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Do you think America has a way out, or is this the price it will pay forever? And if you found this deep dive eye-opening, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next investigation into the forces reshaping the world right now. Hit the like button if you want more bold, fact-based stories like this. And we'll see you in the next one.